Hardcore was built on chaos. It was violent, messy, and self-destructive. But in the late 80s, a new breed of hardcore kids emerged. They weren't just screaming about how fucked up the world was, they were trying to change it. They called it Youth Crew. And depending on who you ask, it was either hardcore's greatest evolution or its most annoying. This wasn't just a subgenre in the grand scheme of hardcore. It was a movement that had shaped hardcore's DNA, divided the scene, and left behind a legacy that still fuels hardcore today. Alright, let's set the stage. It's the early 80s, and hardcore is still figuring itself out. And in cities like LA, Boston, and New York, that meant pure mayhem. It's about as unhinged as music can get without actually being illegal. Although, to be fair, a lot of these venues didn't have licenses, so technically, yeah, it kind of was illegal. Hardcore didn't have rules, but that was kind of the point. Every city had its own scene, its own attitude, but for the most part, it was about playing as fast as possible and hoping you didn't get knocked out before the first band finished. It wasn't about having a philosophy. It wasn't about building a movement. It was about energy, passion, and making sure your set was over before the cops showed up. In some cities, hardcore shows could turn into straight up brawls. It was aggressive. Violence at shows, cheap beer, and bad decisions were just a part of it, at least in a lot of scenes. And then, Minor Threat happened.
I'm not gonna go sell people on my ideas. I'm not gonna go out and try to get people to convert to hardcore or do whatever.
Why are you doing what you're doing?
Because it's for me, not for anyone else.
Now, this is when things started to change, because when Ian MacKaye wrote Straight Edge in 1981, he wasn't trying to start a movement. He wasn't telling people what to do. He was just some guy saying, hey, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do drugs. That's just me. And for a while, that's all it was. It was just a song about a guy's personal stance. But the thing about hardcore music is that people don't just listen to it, they live it. So when Minor Threat wrote that song, some kids didn't just agree with it, they made it their entire lifestyle. So while most of the scene was still about pushing limits, a handful of hardcore kids were starting to think, maybe we could do something else. Let's be clear here though, hardcore was still hardcore. Straight edge wasn't a thing yet. It was just an idea floating around in the middle of all this chaos. Hardcore wasn't some feel-good movement about unity or personal growth. Not yet anyway. It was fast, it was aggressive, and for most people in the scene, that's all it needed to be. But in 1985, one band took that idea and flipped hardcore on its head entirely. Yo, just real quick, I really enjoy making these videos for you guys, and if you enjoy watching them and you want to show your support in the form of something other than just liking and subscribing, I have channel memberships now. We have lots of cool perks and stuff, and we also have a Discord server too, where we chat about music and shit. So come hang out. It could be fun. Also, I'm trying to reach 10,000 subs before the end of the year, so if you fancy it, then please hit that subscribe button and make my day. Right, back to the video. By the mid-80s, hardcore was changing. It wasn't just fast punk anymore. Bands were getting heavier, tougher, and way more influenced by metal. Hardcore bands started pulling in metallic riffs, double kick drums, and that signature chug-chug guitar tone. Shows were getting more violent, and the whole tough guy image started to creep in. Some hardcore kids loved this, but others wanted hardcore to stay hardcore, fast, stripped down, and about energy, not just about brute force. And that's where Youth Crew stepped in. This is youth of today, and if Minor Threat planted the seed for Straight Edge, these guys turned it into a movement. Hardcore had always been about raw energy, but with Youth Crew, this was hardcore on a mission. Ray Cappo and John Porcelli didn't want to just play fast. They wanted hardcore to have a sense of purpose, to be about more than just getting kicked in the face in a New York club basement. Musically, Youth Crew took classic hardcore and made it faster, tighter, and way more anthemic. Lyrically, it wasn't just about being angry at the world, it was about bettering yourself. Hardcore, but with homework, I guess. And visually, this was the first time hardcore had a look, like an actual recognizable style. They had the Youth Crew look, which was very different to the stereotypical skinhead fashion worn by many in the New York hardcore scene before 1988. Kids were wearing Nikes, Champion hoodies, camo shorts, and varsity jackets. Show up to a hardcore gig dressed like this, and everyone knew what bands you're into. But youth of today weren't alone. Almost overnight, a whole wave of bands jumped on the movement. Bold were basically the kids of the movement. They started out as Crippled youth when they were barely teenagers, then rebranded as Bold when they grew into their sound. Side by Side brought the crew mentality, like, you mess with one of us, You Mess With All of Us kind of thing. They were harder, more of a gang vibe band, but still carried that same youth crew energy, just with a bit more attitude. Then you had Gorilla Biscuits. And if Youth of Today were the preachers, these guys were that, just a bit more fun. Gorilla Biscuits weren't as strict or militant. They were still youth crew, but they had melody and a sense of humor. A lot of these bands found a home at Revelation Records, which became the label for youth crew. If you were into hardcore in the late 80s, you were checking out Revelation for the next latest and greatest. A lot of the youth crew bands were straight edge, but this wasn't just about no drinking. It was about hardcore having a sense of purpose, a way to be disciplined, positive, and part of something bigger. And not every youth crew band was edge. Gorilla Biscuits, for example, weren't preaching sobriety, but the movement was tied to the idea that hardcore could be more than just chaos. For some people, youth crew was hardcore's next evolution, but for others, it was annoying as fuck. Because now this wasn't just about the music, it now came with ideals. Straight edge wasn't new, Minor Threat had planted the seed years earlier, but youth crew took it further. No drinking, no smoking, no drugs, that was standard. But then some bands started taking it further, including veganism and no casual sex. They were complete lifestyle changes, and what started out as "this is my choice" now became "this is the right choice." For a lot of kids, this was empowering, a way to reject self-destruction and bettering yourself. But to others, it felt preachy, like hardcore was suddenly full of people telling you what you could and couldn't do. And in a scene that had always been about rebellion, that didn't sit well. For a lot of hardcore kids, the whole point was that there were no rules. Hardcore had always been open-minded, like you didn't have to belong, you just had to show up. But then this youth crew movement started to make hardcore feel exclusive, and now to some people, youth crew wasn't just a movement, it became a clique. A new crowd where if you weren't straight edge, then you weren't one of them. And then came Judge, who took the youth crew message and made it more militant. Judge formed back in 1987 by Mike Ferrara and John Porcelly, who had already been about in Youth of Today and Gorilla Biscuits. These guys weren't just another youth crew band, they were still preaching about their roots, but now with an entirely new attitude. Where Youth of Today were all about positivity and breaking down walls, Judge were about staring you down and making sure you stayed in your lane. They had a much heavier sound to other youth crew bands, drawing influence from the metal scenes. To these guys, straight edge wasn't a choice, it became a weapon, and if you weren't with them, you were against them. At this point, it wasn't just about punks versus metalheads versus hardcore kids. Hardcore was fighting itself, and Judge were laying the groundwork for something much heavier, a more brutal, no-nonsense strain of hardcore that would eventually lead to beatdown. By the early 90s, the youth crew movement was at its peak, but it was also starting to fall apart. Bands started breaking up. In 1989, Youth of Today packed it in, and Bold followed swiftly after. Side by Side dropped one record and said peace. The cracks were showing, and now hardcore was moving in a new direction, one that was heavier, darker, and less positive. In some scenes, straight edge took a hard turn, evolving into the militant hardline movement. Youth crew wasn't gone, but it had lost its momentum. Hardcore was moving forward and the scene was shifting with it, but even though youth crew died, its influence never really disappeared. By 1992, youth crew was over, but its impact didn't stop there, because even after the original wave burnt out, youth crew left a permanent mark on hardcore. Hardcore in the 90s got heavier, darker, and way more political. But as the new millennium approached, a new wave of youth crew bands started popping up, bringing the sound and message back. 10 Yard Fight felt like a direct continuation of Youth of Today. There was In My Eyes, who were a lot more melodic, but still had that fast and urgent energy that was so prominent in early youth crew. And then Floorpunch took that youth crew energy and mixed it with harder breakdowns. And then there was Fastbreak, a band that kept youth crew alive with records like Fast Cars, Fast Women, but like hardcore itself, they didn't stay in one lane. Over time, their sound evolved, pulling in more melody. Just like hardcore as a whole was expanded in new directions. The 90s saw a wave of bands taking youth crew's core ideas and making them heavier, darker, and meaner. Bands like Earth Crisis, Hatebreed, and Blood for Blood brought in influences from thrash and death metal, turning that energy into something more brutal. That groundwork that Judge laid pioneered a new style of heavier and more confrontational style of hardcore. Beatdown spawned from it, promoting a tougher attitude and just straight up intimidating energy. Judge didn't just make youth crew heavy, they helped push hardcore into something more brutal. This wasn't a new movement, but a revival, and it proved that youth crew never really died, it just went back underground. But even today, you can still hear youth crew's DNA in hardcore. Mindforce and Magnitude carry the high energy and fast-paced spirit of youth crew, whereas one step closer are straight edge bands taking the more melodic side of youth crew, but still keeping it hardcore. Then we have bands like Drain, who aren't youth crew, but still carry that same energy and spirit, just with a more thrashy sound. The sound might have changed from what it once was, but its spirit is still there throughout all corners of hardcore. However, Youth Crew isn't just a relic of the past. There are still bands keeping that same energy alive today. Take Absolute Truth, for example, a straight-edge hardcore band from Chicago. Their sound is fast, urgent, and packed with yelled gang vocals which are very reminiscent to Youth of Today and Turning Point, just with a slightly modern edge. Then you've got their War Records label mates, Berthold City, who are keeping that Youth Crew torch burning just as bright, proving decades later the movement still hits just as hard. And it's not just in the US. Bands like Insist and True Vision have kept Youth Crew alive in the UK, proving that the movement's message and sound still resonates worldwide. And in a way, this whole split between pure chaos and disciplined structured hardcore still exists today. Hardcore is full of contradictions, chaos and structure, positivity and aggression, no rules and too many rules. Youth Crew didn't just shape hardcore, it exposed the cracks that still divide the scene today. And whether you love it or hate it, there's no denying that it changed hardcore forever. I've been James. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed. Thanks for watching.